Welcome to Sanity, a podcast by the New York Sun. My name is A.R. Hoffman, and every week, along with my co-host Rebecca Sugar, we try to make sense out of the nonsense and bring a little bit of sanity to your week. Welcome to 2026, Rebecca.
Hi, Happy New Year, Ari.
Yeah.
We're off to a roaring start.
We are.
The quote of the week this week comes from someone I never thought I'd actually quote. The reality TV show actor Spencer Pratt from a show I'm embarrassed to say I've watched, The Hills, which I'm sure you haven't.
He's running for, isn't he running for governor?
He announced his run for LA mayor. He's going to challenge Karen Bass. And he's been very vocal for the last year since the Palisades fires, and even a little bit before that, about the failures of local and state government to prevent these fires and then to help the community rebuild afterwards. And it's been a year, and it's been very, very slow going, almost disastrously. So very few people have gotten permits to rebuild, and there's a lot of heel dragging by state and local governments and by insurance companies. And he's been really online, pulling out his megaphone every day to talk about this. Also about the enormous amount of fraud that's happened in California with money raised for fire victims that never made it to fire victims, went to NGOs and other public officials. And I just had to quote the beginning of his announcement for his mayoral run. He said, "I got more water coming out of my eyes than LADWP had in both our reservoirs." So I don't know, he might have a chance. He's got a sense of humor and he's got a way with the camera. And Karen Bass is certainly no formidable opponent, at least in terms of being able to defend herself against her behavior before, during, and after the fires. So let's see if Spencer Pratt becomes the next mayor of Los Angeles.
Right, and of course, LA or California generally has given us, Ronald Reagan, an actor turned politician, and of course the great Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Right. Not that you're comparing Spencer Pratt to Ronald Reagan.
I would never think to do so. But that's absolutely a good race to watch, especially as the governor there. Angles for the Democratic nomination. So it's good to be with you. Of course, the big story this week is Venezuela, and we'll dive into all of that. I also want to just mention our interview this week, which was really amazing, with an expert down in Caracas on the ground, reporting what's happening there, what it's been like there this week, and what comes next. So check out our interview. It'll be released, Philip Gussman, it'll be released on Sunday, and that'll focus really everything you need to know or want to know on the situation in Venezuela. We're going to spend time down there, and then we're going to spend some time on the Caracas on the Hudson, as New York City might be on its way to becoming, with great. a look at some of Mayor Mamdani's early moves, and then I think we have a kind of a fun group of sunlights and sunburn. So it's very much a kind of like post New Year's hangover edition, right. But I will say we didn't have much time to recover with the dramatic events in Venezuela. It's amazing. Rebecca, we have been talking about Venezuela. We've been talking about the attacks on the drug boats, military presence there, but things kind of came to a head all of a sudden. The first thing, my reaction is just what an astonishing display by the United States military. We haven't really seen America's military, I think, carry out an operation like this in a long time. I think there was a sense after the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq that, maybe our military wasn't the world beater that it had once been. But you could say no other country probably could have executed something like this. So from a pure mission operational perspective, it's extraordinary, to abduct Maduro and his wife and bring them here for trial. There's already been an arraignment in that case. An arraignment is just a first court appearance. And the next hearing in that case is due in March. It's sort of an extraordinary situation where the judge, Alvin Hellerstein, is 92 years old. and is now tasked with presiding over what might be one of the most complicated, highest profile cases in living memory. So it's just a great story from a lot of different ways. What were your kind of initial impressions?
Yeah, it was that is the first thing to say, that this is an extraordinary military operation. And the reverberations of that matter, right? Just as when Israel went in and did its precision strikes in Qatar or in Lebanon, it sends a signal to the rest of the world about what your capabilities are. And that's an incredibly important thing for any country to have. There was sort of this whole story feels like there are sort of three different sets of questions to ask. And I think a lot of people conflate them and try to answer them together, which is the mistake I think that is being made. The question of what's good or moral or ethical or right is one question, right? Is it good that Maduro, an authoritarian communist dictator who took a bad situation in Venezuela and made it much, much worse, is gone? Yes, it's good. That's anybody who's measuring that by ethical and moral standards would have to conclude that that's a net positive for the world, certainly for Venezuelans. But that's not the same question as the other two questions that need to be asked here, which is what's good for the U.S. and its interests. It's good that Maduro's gone because now there's an opportunity for the United States to create some reality with Venezuela in which American interests will be served. Those include keeping China's influence at bay, or stopping some of the drug trafficking, or even taking the oil or working with the Venezuelans and building up our oil infrastructure there. Whatever that looks like, those are in America's interest. So if you're just asking the question in terms of that, the Monroe-Donroe doctrine, there are a lot of positive answers to that question. And then there's this larger question of, what's good for the world, I guess, which sounds like a very globalist thing to say, and I don't mean it that way. But this whole question of, is this legal? Can a country go in and take a leader from another country? What does regime change look like? All of those questions are an entirely separate basket, and they're related to the first two, I suppose, but they're not necessarily the same. And there's real debate about that. And our administration is clearly saying that this was legal. There are criminal indictments out for him. But what does it mean to have a criminal indictment and you don't go through Interpol, and that you just act unilaterally, and all that is a whole other basket of questions. So I think it's important to separate them out, because people are getting caught up in the sort of moral and emotional side of this question, and defending these actions based on the answer to that. Or if there are people who think he should have stayed there, I guess they mostly live in Cuba or China. They're answering it emotionally based on their perspective. But that's really kind of irrelevant, actually, in terms of the geopolitical conversation that we want to have about this.
Yeah, that's a great sort of outline. I totally think you're right. This is multiple things can be true at the same time. So for me, I took my cues, at least my early cues on this, from Venezuelans themselves, and their joy, their relief, both in Caracas, in Venezuela, but also around the world. Images of Venezuelans celebrating in Buenos Aires, in Miami, elsewhere, and so there's a little
even
bit of,
Ana Navarro on The View was celebrating it. That tells you something, right?
Yeah, so there's a little bit of kind of like humility, right, where you have to say, like, the people most affected by this. And of course you always have to say, is there selection bias? But I really don't know a single Venezuelan, or I haven't seen any, real objection to Maduro being deposed. I've seen lots on the other side of the ledger. So that initial pulse check, I think, came out in favor of this action, or in favor of deposing Maduro. On the other hand, the people who were protesting this were like the worst of the worst. It's like the Hands Off Venezuela crowd is like the pro-Iran, pro-Hamas, anti-Israel, anti-America crowd, right? So if you're just kind of taking signals of like, where are my people? Who's my team? I think I'm comfortable being on the right side of not of history, but of the decision, at least at the moment. But then there are these downstream considerations. They had that surreal press conference where Trump is talking about the oil and running Venezuela. I think skepticism is warranted there. And I would have liked to see more of a focus. Maybe it's kind of like the neocon in me. I would have liked to see more of a focus on democracy. I think we heard a kind of nuanced account in our interview of where exactly is Venezuela, right? Is that possible? And I think, one of the things that I gleaned from that conversation is that, like, actually maybe not, right? Maybe this kind of halfway measure was the right move, for
democracy building hasn't really worked out for the United States. It hasn't
worked,
in the past.
and we do get to the question of, like, you don't want to overlearn the lessons, but you want to learn the lessons. And I think that's the delicate dance, we're in now. This question of, like, almost it's like Schrodinger's cat, like it's both regime change and not regime change at the same time. Like, it's hard to know exactly what it is. And the other is, I do think there's a worrisome precedent here. Not that I think expansionist countries like China or Russia needed excuses, but, like, it's going to be a lot harder, I think, to say, China, don't take Taiwan, right? Don't kidnap Taiwan's leaders, or to say to Russia, don't, it's a lot harder now. I mean, this was an act of force and an act of control.
I guess we could say that, not too many people think that China wouldn't take Taiwan anyway.
Right.
But you're right. It gives it an excuse. But
yeah.
the other thing I worry about is sort of not that as much as in a world in which we have a president, AOC, God forbid, one day, and she builds consensus amongst Americans and maybe some European leaders that Bibi Netanyahu is illegitimate and needs to be plucked from his position. I know he's duly elected and Maduro was not, but those are minor details when you want to depose a leader of another country who you feel is not aligned with your interests. And does this open the gate for a future American leadership to do things that we would find really objectionable? There is a question about that, and I worry about that a little bit.
I remember during the Cold War, it was both America and the Soviet Union who were engaged in this competition of replacing, leaders or kind of influencing events in countries. So the left is just as much a tradition of doing this kind of thing as the right. I think
they tried to do it here in our own country to Donald Trump himself, actually.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I mean, I think the trial, and we can come back to the Venezuela out, but the trial is not going to be simple for the government. I mean, it's very hard to try a foreign leader. It's very hard to get the right evidence. So, there's a possibility here that this, doesn't really work out. I mean, in some sense, it would have been easier just to assassinate him, honestly. Or you might have
never too late, I guess.
Or just as I'm not advocating. I just think that, like, this question of trying him here. I mean, Trump himself said it's going to be a slog of a case.
It'll be years, right? We're assuming
years. He's going to challenge his abduction, of course. The case against Noriega dragged on for years and years and years and years. So, the way this played out was, on the one hand, a huge success, but there's still a lot of unknowns on the other end of it. Not the least is sort of like, how is this relationship between America and Venezuela going to work now?
Yeah.
I mean, do we have the patience and the commitment to really see this thing through?
Right.
And especially as, like, elections aren't that far off, and is a Democrat going to be committed to, like, administering Venezuela? Is Trump going to be committed in a year or 2 years? I don't know.
I just want to point to one of the dumbest things I heard said in this whole situation, maybe the day after the operation or 2 days. Margaret Brennan was interviewing Marco Rubio about the operation. And she asked, well, there are indictments against some of the other guys in Venezuela. Why didn't you take all of them?
Yeah.
And, it just struck me. And he answered her exactly the right way, which is to sort of mock the question. But we so underappreciate the complexity of an operation like this, and the way you described it is just so extraordinary what they did. I think she viewed it like a video game, like you just drop your guy in there, and while you're picking up Maduro off of a military base in the middle of a country, why don't you just go get the other guys too? There's this sort of inability of our sort of media class to even understand what just happened and how impressive it actually was and how difficult it was. Even for a military as sophisticated as ours. And so I just think that, everybody sort of has these views about this. Like, why don't we just do this? Why don't we just do that? As though everything's just so easy. And why don't we just do what we want to do? But everything's very complicated.
No, for sure. And I mean, one interesting kind of inside baseball American question here is, does this mark the ascension of Marco Rubio as the dominant figure in the administration? I was interested in the fact that J.D. Vance was nowhere to be seen. None of the press conferences, none of, wasn't standing behind, nowhere. And, there's interesting questions there about a topic we've covered a lot from a kind of inside MAGA world perspective. Was this Vance distancing himself from this kind of thing? I wonder about those kind of power players.
Right. And there were murmurings, though, that Vance was part of the decision not to go in and start talking about democracy and regime change because of that MAGA sensitivity. And so he might have been very much a part of the decision making, just not out front.
Yeah, but this was clearly a Rubio operation, and it's interesting. It's interesting to see that, Trump come around to at least that position.
Do you think Cuba's next?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely a possibility. I don't, the question is is this now kind of like a playbook, that America will do will execute in other countries, similar to how Israel kind of has a playbook for how it takes out terrorists, in other countries or whatever. I mean, is this now, it's the Donroe Doctrine question. I mean, is this now a multi-part plan that is going to be executed? The
thing to worry about there for President Trump and for his movement and his base in particular is that, again, this is not the thing that animates MAGA, right? They want to see more action domestically and less action on foreign shores. And so if this becomes a playbook and he starts toppling governments one by one, he's going to have to show a very strong economy to get them to overcome their aversion to these kinds of adventures.
I mean, listen, it's not just Cuba. I mean, Iran is a huge question right now. What happens there? I mean, there are flag burnings in Isfahan. I wonder, whether are similar options being explored vis-a-vis Iran. I don't know. It starts to become a little bit of a full plate. In terms of. This
is why MAGA doesn't like this idea of foreign adventures, because there's no end to the number of them that we could engage in and probably have good reasons to engage in. But at what point do you say, enough is enough and focus your energies at home?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I've said it before, historically, presidents turn to foreign policy in their second terms. They think about legacy. Their power, their domestic power wanes. Generally, their approval rating goes down, and foreign policy is the one area where they can kind of, do what they want. But it's often a trap, right? I mean, Clinton bet everything on peace negotiations and got Oslo done, but that ended in heartbreak. And other presidents as well, have sort of there's a little bit of a chasing the Nobel Prize or just chasing legacy, right? And there's a lot of warning signs there, I think.
Okay. Should we talk a little bit about the Minnesota shooting?
Yeah. Speaking of domestic policy, my first instinct is, the video to me doesn't feel entirely conclusive one way or the other. I'm not a forensic expert. I don't know. I think a lot of the rhetoric from Jacob Fry and Tim Waltz was obviously extreme, and they're looking to harness this. I also think, though, a lot of this is a tinderbox. I mean, we've said this before, these kind of roundups, armed agents, in broad daylight. It's I don't know. I think something like this was bound to happen. And I don't know. I'm sort of on board on the broader immigration, but these kinds of actions have made me uncomfortable for a while.
Yeah, I would if I were running this, I would double down on the number of ICE agents today in Minnesota. I would flood the zone with ICE agents. This is a tinderbox because you have groups of people running around, doxing ICE agents, throwing things at them, blocking the streets where they are screaming at them, and sometimes literally running into them with cars and dragging agents from cars. That's happened several times in Minnesota, actually, in the last few weeks itself. And so while it's always tragic when someone gets shot, this is not some peaceful protester just standing on a sidewalk, yelling her objections to a policy she disagreed with. This is a woman who was reportedly trailing ICE all day, obstructing, leading a whole caravan of cars that were trying to obstruct. And then, by any legal measure, she was, trying to use her car to escape, or whether she was deliberately trying to run these ICE agents over. How did we get to this place in America where that's acceptable behavior and where you don't risk getting hurt or even shot if you engage in it? This isn't about protesting. This is about this sort of violent kind of activism that's being egged on by leaders like Fry, who unbelievably spoke in English and not in Somali when he was attacking this event, and Tim Walz, who honestly, luckiest man in the world to have this to talk about and not the, Sanity, the committee hearings that just happened the same day about the fraud that he oversaw. So, this idea that this was bound to happen is exactly correct, but not because ICE is in the area, but because all of these people think it's their right and honor and duty to violently and physically engage with law enforcement, and that there won't be any consequences to that. And I'm sorry that someone got shot. I truly am. But the tinderbox is not being created by ICE. It's being created by the people on the streets.
Yeah, I hear you. It's definitely a good take and a good perspective. I just think if you say to me, if you support, broadly speaking, immigration crackdown, is that effort in better or worse shape than it was 2 days ago? I'd say, it's in worse shape. I mean, these kinds of incidents, regardless of blame, I think, it's.
But that's just incentive That's incentive for people to make these conditions happen over and over again, such that you can never affect immigration control, right? That's the point.
No,
they want this kind of event. They didn't want someone to die, but they'd be very happy if that woman had gotten shot in the arm and gone to the hospital and healed, because that's what they want. That's why they're there, to cause chaos. What if they did the responsible thing and protested responsibly and in the right way? Because there is a right way and a wrong way.
Yeah.
But they don't, so that people like us will say the things you just said. But I refuse to say it. No, we need twice as much enforcement now.
Well, no, they're questions of whether these raids, how they're executed, and are effective, and whether a good policy idea. I think the question of is going to be obviously adjudicated in court in terms of the guilt. My sense is the police officer has a pretty good defense case, based on the video, and at least kind of plausible. So I that we'll see what happens there. But I think in terms of the political stakes of this, it's not great. It's
not great for the other side. It's not great for the protesters and for Jacob Fry and for Tim Walz. And they're the ones that have to rethink their position on this, not the Trump administration and ICE.
I don't know. We'll see the polling, but my sense is most folks don't want a 37-year-old woman executed in her car.
She wasn't executed. That's
she was
that's
shot.
the wrong
she
word.
Was shot. She was shot.
She
in
was
her car.
shot in self-defense because she was obstructing law enforcement and trying to either run one of them over or escape while being detained. And
but Rebecca, the point. This has been a question for law enforcement for 100 years. Is what there's always been friction. The idea that there never have been protesters, look at the 60s. Look at people on the streets. This is something you have to think about, right?
You're suggesting they haven't thought about it. Of course they have. And his response, by any measure, from a law enforcement perspective, if you feel that you're in imminent danger, or your fellow officers are, from someone with a dangerous weapon, in this case, a 2-ton vehicle, that is baked into the training and to the considerations of how you operate. They didn't go hunting people who were protesting on a sidewalk. This wasn't some protester standing over there and they're like, let's shoot that woman, right? She wasn't just happening by. And so to assume that this was some kind of fault of the police or of the law enforcement, that they didn't take this into account, that there'd be friction, is to allow the exact goal of these protesters to win the day. And I don't think that should be allowed.
Yeah. No, I don't think that I shouldn't operate. I think the question of the question of lethal force is one to ask. Like I said, everyone can see the video. People can kind of make up their own minds. And I totally agree. I agree that the response from Walt and Fry was disgraceful. It was disgraceful and it was obscene. And I think sober head should prevail. There's a lot of obviously incendiary rhetoric, and that's the last thing last thing you want. And the last thing also you want is these kind of confrontations to deteriorate even more.
Last thing I want are illegal immigrants, pouring into our country without consequence, and then a bunch of people thinking they can impede justice and then blame the justice system when they get harmed. Protest properly. You're allowed to protest. You're allowed to hate this policy. You're not allowed to bring your car and try to stop it in midstream.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So let's go from Minneapolis to New York. From
bad to worse.
Bad to worse. One of the things I'll start off with saying is just, Mamdani promised that his team would be defined by excellence. There was this whole mishigas that, 500,000 people have applied, we're more selective than Harvard, and in reality, it's emerging that a lot of these teams are like
the same people
losers.
who applied to Harvard, actually.
right. But it's like one person is worse than the next. And there's no vetting of these people. I think it confirmed exactly what a lot of us believe, that he was drawing from this hyper activist, far left sort of ideological pool of people. This has come to a head in the case of Sia Weaver, right? Who we've written about, we've editorialized about as the director of tenant advising or tenant rights office. She has some experience in that, but she also has experience in tweets that are hateful of white people, hateful of capitalism, hateful of home ownership when she's the advisor of tenants' rights. And then this kind of breakdown on the street, classic example of someone being a bully online. And then when they're confronted, she's melting down.
There's no crying in politics.
There's
right?
no crying, but it's everything.
John Boehner taught us years ago.
Yeah. So it's just, and Mamdani's doubling down on her, I think, because they realize that, if there are too many people in their administration who think and have said the same thing, there would be no end to it if they didn't. So it's it's not looking good early on. I
just wanted to read a quote. A lot of people are talking about the quote from Sia Weaver where she talks about, I don't even know, the home ownership stuff, and they're reacting to it about collective ownership and individual ownership, and that's bad enough. I actually found this quote of hers worse. She said, if ICE and the National Guard are coming to New York City, which we know they are, we really have to use our tenant associations and our teacher associations and our public schools as like networks of defense in support of Zoran's agenda and in support of our neighbors. So first of all, I always teach my kids, don't say like when you're giving public statements. But, she is just sort of the example of that sort of annoying, like Harvard student that we all can't stand. But
she definitely didn't go to Harvard. So she applied to Harvard, she didn't get in, and she got somewhere else. Yeah,
she's just annoying on every level. But this is actually really serious and really dangerous. It's not the policies that she believes in, which I think are stupid and silly and ill-informed, but this idea that so many on the far left have, that they should use particularly students and public schools as sort of levers and as venues to push their legislation, their policy, their ideology. It's such an abuse of children. This is child abuse, but everybody does it, right? Turn our little students into little, good soldiers for your cause, and to use our civic institutions and everything that has to do with parents and teachers to weaponize them and use them to advance your agenda. She really believes that. And most people on the far left do, and most people do it all the time. And we all just sort of look past it. And I find it horrible and offensive, and it leads to all kinds of other issues. But it's deliberate because, right, they're cooking up the next generation of their little communist comrades by indoctrinating them early on. And that's the thing that we should really fight against, because long after Mamdani is gone, all of these associations and the people that have been brought up in them are going to endure, and they're going to have these ideologies. And so it's well past Sia Weaver at this point, but she is exactly the problem.
Yeah. No, I mean, we ran a story that the New York Department of Teachers Union was devoting a day this week to teaching Palestinian. Like, what is that? Why is that being taught in the classroom? It's like you said, these are now seen as just ideological, like platforms. Shock troops and platforms. Yeah. I just, it just bothers me when people say, oh, these tweets were a long time ago, oh, whatever, she's a really serious person. If these tweets were said about any other group, and you say this all the time, other than, white people, whatever, she would not last a half a millisecond. No. Right.
And some of them weren't that long ago, by the way. Right. She's not that old. It's not like they're 30.
It's fine. Yeah. And so it's just, it's gaslighting. Like, it's really gaslighting, and especially by some of the people, Ross Barkan, David Cleon, whatever, these kind of Mamdani like zombies, who are saying, oh, he's really moderate, don't whatever. It's so untrue.
But in fairness to Zoran, I guess he's never once said that he was gonna govern as anything but a communist, democratic socialist, he says. And so why wouldn't he hire people like Sia Weaver? It's like obvious that he would, and anybody who voted for him voted for this. And they're probably not even bothered by it. So we're sort of talking to ourselves. I don't know.
I think the more he can be held to account for these appointments, and have to answer for them. The Sia Weaver stuff felt like, it was everywhere. We cover extensively. It was in the Post. He should. Yeah,
he should answer for them. But he's keeping her. He's keeping her.
He's keeping her. Yeah. But even still, I think saying, surfacing these tweets, saying, do you believe this? Saying, do you endorse this? Is a kind of accountability. And we'll see. And
we didn't even mention that he sort of demoted the NYPD commissioner, Jessica Tisch, to, from her daily briefings directly with him to the briefings with deputy. And then he's saying maybe not. But, clearly, even that he kind of, nodded in that direction tells us everything we need to know about his view of the police, his, retaining of Jessica Tisch notwithstanding.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Let's go on to our sunlight. And my sunlight is a story that is kind of brewing out in England, and it's all kind of a sunburn, but here it is, and that is the West Midlands Police. Right, there was a soccer match a few months ago between Aston Villa, a Birmingham soccer club, football club, and Maccabi Tel Aviv. And the Tel Aviv fans were banned from the match. Astonishing. So they couldn't go. So only one team was there. Because the police issued a report that they were worried about rioting or unrest. It's now come out, drip, drip, drips, but slowly, that report was entirely fabricated. That there was no evidence for it. Just this morning, as we a few minutes before we went to record, the mayor of Amsterdam said, "Hey, some of the information that was attributed to me, it was a lie. That's not what we believe." And so it was coming into focus. Was a clear effort just to exclude Israelis. Astonishing. We've seen anti-Semitism, anti-Israeli sentiment in sports all over, but this was really amazing because it involved the cover-up of the police. And the idea that the corruption, we talked about law enforcement, we both hold law enforcement in incredibly high regard. The idea that law enforcement, and you've spoken about ideological capture in England of institutions and of the Metropolitan Police, is breathtaking. It's absolutely breathtaking, and it's such a corruption of their job, which is to keep everyone safe, and instead talk about using that power in such a petty, small, hateful way to exclude Israelis from watching a soccer match. So we'll be covering that story, but it's, I think, indicative of a lot that's going on in the UK right now.
Yeah, I love it when you rag on the UK and Europe.
I know. I join you. I know. I know my audience.
My sunlight is about the Maha press briefing that happened, I think it was yesterday, that revised the dietary guidelines in America. RFK Jr. and other officials from HHS and other agencies talked about the complete inversion, actually, of our food pyramid that I grew up on. I don't know if you did, but, I was eating all the Wonder Bread in the world because that was like the biggest part of the pyramid. And now we're learning that, eggs and steak are good again. I just wanted to take a quick quote from what RFK Jr. said at that conference. He said, quote, "For decades, Americans have grown sicker while healthcare costs have soared. The reason is clear. The hard truth is that our government has been lying to us to protect corporate profit-taking. Federal policy promoted and subsidized highly processed foods and refined carbohydrates and turned a blind eye to the disastrous consequences. Today, the lies stop. The new guidelines recognize that whole nutrient-dense food is the most effective path to better health and lower healthcare costs." Just two quick points to make about this. First of all, there's so much going on in the world, in Venezuela and Iran and all these sort of major events. This almost feels like a small thing, but what could be more important than the health of the American people? What's more in the national interest than that? And as Dr. Mehmet Oz said from the podium yesterday, right, this has implications for healthcare costs in America. The staggering amount of money we spend on the chronic illness epidemics that are the direct results of obesity in America, type 2 diabetes and other illnesses that result, that alone is worth addressing. And then not to mention the idea that, staggering number of our young men and women can't pass a military grade physical exam, or just people are just not as productive and healthy in their everyday lives. So this has real implications for the entire country, and it's to do with corporate interests in the sense that, right, Brooke Rollins was up there talking about agriculture and how the country's had these regulations and mandates in some cases on farms to use certain chemicals to prevent against pests and all that, but those degrade the soil and rob our food of its nutrients. And all of those issues are going to be addressed by this administration. And it's not as sexy and interesting as oil tankers being, intercepted in the waters off of South America. But this is a kind of nonpartisan issue that everybody can get interested in and excited about. If just that happened, if just our food supply were healthier and better for every American, then Maha will delivered on a major promise, and America will be in a much better place. So everyone should take a look at that press conference. It's really important.
and eat healthier. I like the guideline that says alcohol's okay, just don't have it for breakfast.
Damn,
there goes my cut back on whiskey with my cinnamon
with
toast
your Fruit
crunch.
Loops.
Right, exactly. My sunburn is against the staff of Bread's Bakery. I don't know if some folks saw this, but Bread's Bakery is a lovely chain, fantastic babka, great baked goods, Israeli company that's found success here and not just in New York. And now the staff is saying they don't want to be complicit in genocide anymore. Bread should denounce their support for Israel. It's all blah, 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 blah. And it's just like, it's so insane to me. You're working for an Israeli company that is doing well and that is successful. Your complaints aren't really about your salary or your working hours or your healthcare. It's about the fact that they're Israeli. And it just shows like the utter sort of ideological zombie brain of so much of the anti-Israel movement, and just the real sort of disconnect and just awful rot that's happened where people aren't proud to work for a successful company. They're not grateful for the opportunity and or whatever. The fact that politics has to enter into that.
Because they're eating too many carbohydrates. They haven't seen the new dietary guidelines.
They just need to eat tomahawk steaks, and they'll be good. But anyway, so Bread's Bakery unionization. On the whole, I want everyone to have good working hours. I want them to earn good living and good benefits. But I think too often union pushes become these, as you said about kind of teachers unions and education, these extremist ideological projects that actually have nothing to do with ensuring, just a better job and better conditions, but become these proxy wars for these insane, woke, like, dreams of like whatever boycotting Israel and stuff. So I love Bread's Bakery, love Israeli businesses, will continue to support them, and everyone should too.
Okay, and my sunburn, just back to the fraud situation in Minnesota, which keeps going and going. It's like the ever ready.
And we didn't even mention that Tim Walz not running for a third term. That's
right, which which is a whole story unto itself and how he handled that. But there was a House Oversight Committee hearing on this fraud, and they had these witnesses come and testify. And one of them was Minnesota State Representative Walter Hudson. He actually sits on the House Fraud Prevention and Oversight Committee, and he talked about these welfare incentives turning benefits into business. And he pointed out that we have a culture of, I'm quoting him, a culture of profiting from government programs in perpetuity, not as a safety net, but as an industry, which I think encapsulates the problem and why this keeps going and will only get bigger. Because we like to think of, food assistance and SNAP benefits and welfare of all types as just helping poor people. Of course, we now know that large proportion of the people we thought we were helping who needed it were driving Porsches and other things, and they didn't need the help. But beyond that, there are people who kind of need the help, but then they need it in perpetuity. They need it forever. It becomes like a way of life. It becomes an industry, and that's a form of fraud too. And so all of this is being looked at together. And my real sunburn, though, is that while members of Congress give this a voice and had this spectacular hearing and fireworks were going off and all of this fraud was being exposed, the terrible way in which Governor Walz and other politicians in Minnesota were attacking and harassing whistleblowers. I mean, the detail here is unbelievable what was going on. But so while members of Congress are putting on this big show, acting like they're defending the people, they are now about to sign on to this $5.7 billion in spending in the spending bill that's coming up now, and they're going to pass it on to the House, and then we'll see if it goes through by January 30th. It includes $5.7 billion for refugee spending. That's more than during the Biden administration. So one could argue after all this fraud that we should actually freeze refugee spending until we have a full audit and understand how much fraud there actually has been. But no, the same people screaming at this oversight committee hearing are voting to put more money into the system when there still aren't enough controls on it. So it just goes to show that there's like talking out of both sides of their mouths. And just to put a cap on it, Representative Nancy Mace from, I forget where is she from? North Carolina. She put forward a motion in the Oversight Committee to subpoena Ilhan Omar's immigration records, because as we all think we know, she allegedly married her brother in an immigration fraud scheme to get him into this country. And every single Republican and Democrat voted to table that motion. They don't even want to look. So here we are talking about defrauding our system and trying to resolve this issue that we have. And we won't even look at the case that we know is probably true for whatever political reasons are involved in. And that's on both sides of the political aisle. So we're either going to take this issue of immigration fraud and fraud to our welfare systems by immigrants seriously, or we aren't. And just holding meetings that are televised is not the answer. Getting us all angry and venting and outraged is the first step, but it shouldn't be the last step. And it seems to be that our members of Congress, are one and done. They're just going to get us all riled up, but they're not going to do anything to change it.
Okay, great. On that note, Rebecca, see you next week.
Bye.